In this video, we're going to go over the basics of how you work with components in a Fusion file. Now, if you're familiar with a CAD system that references external parts in an assembly, the first thing to know is that Fusion's equivalent to a part file is a component, and all components exist in the same working Fusion file. There are no external references. Component groups act like subassemblies, and bodies are physical objects that exist either in the global space or in a component. There can be multiple copies or instances of one component, and in that case, modifying one of them will modify all of the other instances similarly. And so in this exercise, we're going to be exploring the different tools that we use to work with components and their component groups. Since a full assembly exists within one file in Fusion, we're going to be working with components, and the first thing that we're going to do is create a component. And a component is essentially a part file within the assembly. And so by right-clicking on the full assembly in the browser, we can choose New Component. And that will create down here a new component called Component 57. By clicking it once, I can rename it and make it, say, Carbon Main. And hitting Enter will then lock that name in. And now we have a new component. And by expanding it, you'll see that it now has its own origin. And that own origin is defined in relation to the origin of the next higher up level. So in this case, the global origin. Now, if I had a part that I wanted to convert into or if I had a body that I wanted to convert into a component, I could go under the Bodies menu here and select that body. In this case, I want to select Carbon Layup. It's that full carbon body there. And I can either right-click and say Create Components from Bodies, and that's essentially going to create a new component with an origin and the body inside of it. But I could also just take that body, click it and hold it down and drag it, and move it into a component that already exists. And so that body will now go into Carbon Main, and you'll see under Carbon Main we now have a folder for bodies, and the body that exists there is Carbon Layup. Now if I have a body existing within a component, I can right-click it and say Create a Component from that body, and it's going to create a new component within that component where that body now exists. And so what this has done essentially is made our original component of Carbon Main into a component group. And component groups are exactly what they sound like. They're just groups of components. And so things are now just defined with an extra level of hierarchy. So we have a body defined in relation to a component, defined in relation to a component group, which is then defined in relation to the global space. You can also move things around between component groups. If I wanted to let's say press Ctrl-Z and undo that action. Let's say I wanted to move that component Carbon Main into an existing component group. I could take Carbon Main and move it into the group Frame Carbon. And when I open that up, you'll find that Carbon Main now exists within that subgroup. Now one more thing to go over is what happens if you drag a component into another component. So right now we're going to drag Rocker into Component Main. So if I took any component A and dragged it into component B is going to convert from a component to a group of components, and anything that existed in component B is going to remain within that full group, within the full group of components. And so its original body is in a body folder that exists in that group of components, and now that rocker is going to be a component within that group. The next thing we'll cover is instancing and referencing. So if you're familiar with a CAD program where your assembly references outside part files, you'll know that when you change that outside part file, usually that file will update in the assembly. Since Fusion is in one design environment where you're working on all the parts together, we do have referenced components. And so components being the equivalent of that outside part file, each component has different instances, and as you change one component, it's going to change all of the instances of that component to match that change. So to demonstrate this, we're going to expand the swing arm assembly and then expand the bearing assembly inside of it. And if you locate this first component in here, it's called SS6003 2RS, you'll find that it's a rather chunky name, and so if we just rename this particular component, let's name it Bearing, you'll notice that it changed this component down here as well to Bearing. And that's because this is not a separate component, it is a second instance of the first component Bearing. And so if you look, anytime you have a component that's been copied and pasted, it'll be component name :1, component name :2, and this is because they are separate instances. So if I went into component 2 or bearing 2, if I made a change to that, like if I scaled it differently, if I cut a hole through it, it's going to make the same change to every instance of bearing. And so this is our way of, within the model, having different parts repeated. They can then reference each other, and so one change to one of them will change any of them. Finally, we're going to go over a tool called component color cycling. And this is a tool that lets us visualize what parts that we're looking at are different components, different instances of components, which can be tricky to do if they're all the same or similar materials. And so just to demonstrate this, we're going to open up the swing arm assembly. And if you isolate the bearing assembly swing arm to frame, we can see just this bearing assembly here. And if I fit it to the page, you can see a little bit better. Under the Inspect menu, there's a tool called Component Color Cycling Toggle. And if we click on it, you'll see that it applies a different color to each of the different components and instances of components. This is just a good way to visualize what's going on with your components, to see where things are different and where they're not. So if you have multiple bodies within one component, it'll color all of those bodies the same. And so this is really good to get a good idea and understanding of where things are and how you're selecting your different components. And to turn off the color cycling, we just go back to Inspect and choose it again. Now, if you do find yourself needing to bring in an outside part file into your current Fusion design, that's pretty simple to do. All you have to do is open up your data panel, find the file that you want to insert, right-click it, and say Insert. And this will bring in the new part file as a new component group within your global space.